Hello again. This is Dr. James Danoff-Burg at the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens, and we're here today to talk about session 2, second in our series. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about creating a question, and then from that question, beginning the process of developing an experiment. And then after we do that, we'll talk a little bit about a series of options, things that we can do so that we'll be able to answer that question, because there are lots of social science tools, and we're going to briefly introduce for the first time a bunch of them today, and we will reintroduce them and bring them up when it's more appropriate in the future, in future sessions. So without further ado, I'm going to begin sharing screen. And let's see if I can choose the right one. And here we are. All right. So today is about organizing research. Session 2, we're going to take the questions that we created last time and develop them further. All right. So first up, a reminder about the larger session. So this helps to organize and contextualize the things that we're talking about. We're here for 11 sessions. We've already done the first one. We're on the second session, which is organizing our research and beginning that research design process. Next session, we'll talk about some more aspects of organizing research, and then we'll begin the process of creating surveys and implementing the surveys, or implementing the protocol for them, testing the surveys, talking about data analysis, both quantitative for two sessions and then qualitative for 2 sessions. And then we'll talk about implementing those projects. So same session outline as we saw last time. Today, let's finish this question about refining our question and then taking that question and doing things with it, identifying variables, creating hypotheses, and especially the null hypotheses, creating predictions, which are different from hypotheses. And then we're going to talk about a variety of different social science research tools that we'll have at our availability for our disposal and use. All right, a reminder, what's the goal of conservation psychology, which is the work that we're doing here in social science? If you said finding and engaging pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and acceptable, gold star to you. In the United States, when we're kids, if we say the right question, we get that gold star in the middle of our forehead when we're very young. This is in the very beginnings of primary school. So pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and acceptable is the goal of conservation psychology. That's what we're doing here today and for the rest of the session. So that behavior change can manifest in a bunch of different ways, right? What we have here is this idea of the ways in which we can enact change in our communities. At the top of this hierarchy that we have here are behaviors, and they're the broadest base of the pyramid because they are the most numerous. There are lots of behaviors that we can identify that we want to try to change in our community, in our populace, in our target group of people. They're faster to change. So we're more likely to be successful if we identify specific behaviors to change than other things that are lower down on the list, as we'll talk through. And they can be very situational specific. So by behavior change, we mean, say, stop throwing trash, or not hunting animals in protected areas, or conserving water, or using reusable, fast-growing fuel from forests as opposed to slow-growing trees. So second on this hierarchy are the intentions to change their behavior, right? So this is a larger concept, fewer challenges or fewer options available to it. But what we want to be able to do is identify the behaviors that people will actually change. So often when we talk about things that we can change in a populace, we talk about behaviors, attitudes, and values. Attitudes are broader picture issues about how I feel about nature, how I feel about my community, how I feel about conservation, a variety of aspects, right? And attitudes are much harder to change than our behaviors. And you may remember when we were talking about the Wes Schultz paper last week about how conservation is behavior, that when we talk about norms, social norms are things that the whole community engages in. And those social norms are very hard to change in a similar way to an individual person or a collective group of people's attitudes, right? Hardest to change of all of these is values, a basic belief system, the things that are central to people's being, right? It often transcends whatever the situation is. I think that helping people is an important value. That goes across conservation, that goes across how I interact with people at a store, it goes across how I work with my colleagues, right? That is a value. Those values are very, very difficult to change. You can almost think of them as sort of religious tenets, right? The center parts of religion. Values are the hardest to change. Value orientations are a little easier to change because that sort of sets your standard, but it's still very difficult to change. Going up the hierarchy, attitudes and norms are a little easier to change, but still very challenging to change what is normal in a society, to change a person's attitude, and especially to change the attitude of a community or of a society. Behavioral intentions, the things that we're intending to change, a little easier, but specific behaviors. I will put this can of soda, no endorsement for that company, into the recycling bin or the trash. But I want people to put it into the recycling bin. That is a great example of a very simple behavior that is very attainable, easy to change, and is situation specific because we need to have a recycling bin there. So this all makes sense, yeah? So behaviors easiest to change, attitudes and norms much harder, values almost impossible. All right, so that's why we focus on pro-environmental behaviors that are voluntarily changed among our community. All right, so when we're trying to make this change happen in a community, we need to be able to determine how effective it's been, right? So we do what is called outcomes-based evaluation. An outcome is a knowledge, an attitude, or a behavior that we're trying to change, right? And as we said, attitudes are some of the harder things to change. Behaviors are much easier. Knowledge is very easy because knowledge is just sharing information. So if we take these three and put them on that same hierarchy that we had on the last thing, knowledge is easiest, behaviors are next easiest, and attitudes are the hardest to change. But we can influence attitudes. We can't influence values very easily, but we can influence attitudes. So when we were trying to do a behavior change program, we want to be able to understand the impacts that we've had. And in many ways, the work that we're doing here in these 11 sessions in this Building Community Conservation Success workshop are basically an evaluation approach. So the outcomes that we try to understand can take two forms for the outcomes. The reach, the number of people that we have interacted with. If we work with schools or we're doing an outreach to communities, it could be the number of communities, the number of schools, the number of people, maybe in total across all of those other situations. That is the reach. Very often when we are doing an evaluation and we are summarizing the impact of our program, the outcome of our program, we talk about the numbers of peoples that we've reached, the number of pamphlets or flyers or schools or communities or people that we have reached. Does that necessarily mean that we have changed their knowledge, behaviors, or attitudes? No, right? Just because we have talked to someone and have shared a piece of information with them or shared a call to action, please put your soda can in the proper recycling bin, That doesn't mean that we have made an impact on them. It means only that we have talked to that many people. We have reached that number of people, okay? So reach is a useful index. It's a useful outcome, but it is, I'd say, the least useful of our approaches. We need to do it. It's essential. People always want to know the number of donors, always want to know the number of people or communities or schools or what have you that you have reached, or flyers that you have distributed, hits to your social media page. But it is the lowest, and I'd say least informative, of all of the kinds of outcomes that we can evaluate. Much more useful is the impact, right? Which is the real change that we have made in our communities, in our people that we're reaching out to. And as I said, the three things that we usually try to measure changes in can be abbreviated as KAB, CAB, right? That's why we put it that way. So it doesn't show the hardest to easiest, as we were talking about on that previous pyramid that comes from environmental psychology. But instead here, we're trying to summarize the CAB, right? So we'll take the CAB to the impact. In the United States, cabs are what we call taxis, or tuk-tuks, or a variety of other names for public transportation. So CAB works well in the United States, since cabs are what we call taxis. So K is knowledge, A is attitudes, B is behaviors. And again, here's a question. Which of these is the easiest to change? Which of these is the next easiest to change? And which is the hardest to change? If you said knowledge was the easiest, behaviors is the next easiest, and attitudes is the hardest, you're correct. Give yourself a pat on the back and a gold star on the forehead. Right? So knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors are what we try to assess. Attitudes are the hardest. So how do we know that our action has led to changes? We do an evaluation. And how do we do an evaluation? What's the basis of those evaluations? The question. So that is why it's so important that we ask good questions from the beginning. Right. So what's your question? What did you come up with at the end of our first session and during our Facebook discussion that we had? Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that. So when we're trying to engage in these behavior change efforts, whenever you're interacting with another person in general, we're entering into a social contract, right? This is something that we don't usually talk about. It's not something that we emphasize, but we are always entering into social contract. When we go up to a person out on the street to ask them to participate in a survey, that's a social contract. When we ask them to make a behavior change, that's a social contract, because we're talking to them, we're asking them to do something with us or for us. Yeah? So when we do that, we have to keep in mind that this is a social exchange. We're giving, they're giving. So there's a cost on our part, and there's a cost on the part of the people that we're working with, the communities that we're working with. That cost could be effort, right? That they have to talk for a while, that you have to talk for a while to collect the data, or it could just be time. It could also be other things. Maybe you're asking other things from them, samples of the wool from their sheep, or milk from their goats or something, because you're trying to do a test of some quality of the milk, right? That's a cost to them in time and in materials that they could otherwise sell. Also, there are rewards to that social contract, right? We benefit, of course, by finding out information from them, by talking with them. Maybe they benefit by thinking more well of us, or by garnering some incentives that we may offer. You know, if you come and sit down here, I have a cold drink for you, and I would like to share that with you. That's an incentive. That's a reward for them to participate in your survey, right? Also, the community that we're working with may benefit because by learning about how effective our event has been, we can learn how to improve that event in the future so that it's a better experience for our communities, right? So in addition, there are costs, there are rewards, and in that social contract, trust is important. Remember when we first start talking to people that there's a bit of a trust that needs to be established. Okay? We're asking them to change their knowledge, their attitudes, their behaviors. They want to be able to trust us that we will ask them to do the right thing and not ask too much. Okay, so when we're thinking about what outcomes we want to ask of our communities, we want to be able to make certain that the things that we are asking do not violate this social contract. We're not asking them to do something that is socially inappropriate, that may violate or jeopardize their standing in the community, and that would violate their trust with us and our trust in them. Okay. So things to keep in mind as we're designing this experiment, as we take this question and begin to create that experience, that experiment, that evaluation. All right. So again, we're still thinking about how to organize our question, organize our research experience, organize our exploration. So the challenge that yet another challenge that we face, because we've talked about a few already, a big challenge that we face is how to choose the best approach that makes the best use of our resources so that we can be most effective and have the greatest impact. If money was unlimited, if our time was unlimited, if our staffing capacities were unlimited, this wouldn't matter. The reality is that everything is limited. If we only have so many staff members, we have only so much time. So we need to think about how we use our resources, our time, our gas, our petrol in our cars to get to places. So we need to be able to think about how we use our resources most effectively and how we can have the greatest impact. Right? I like to say we'd like to be like this cattle egret here that's on the buffalo head. He's making a very large impact with his resources. See what I'm saying? Big impact right down the forehead. So we don't necessarily want to poop on any buffalo heads, but we do want to make a big impact and a big change in our community so that they benefit, so that our organization benefits and our ecosystem and our species benefit. So let's have that greatest of impact. Creating that social contract and working with our communities is a great way to be able to ensure that we can have the greatest impact for the smallest resource cost, time, money, what have you. Okay, so back to our question, because that's the beginning from where everything else originates, right? You've probably heard in other classes, and we talked a little bit about it on our first session, about the scientific method. There is no one scientific method. There are many scientific methods. And I've heard friends say there are many scientific methods as there are scientists, because everybody has a slightly different way of doing things. But we talked about one briefly that involved the baby sampling things and inviting others to replicate the results after they had not the best experience and reported their efforts. But the basis of any scientific method really is the question, because that's where everything comes from. So we need to think very carefully and solidly about how we frame that question. And of course, it needs to be testable. It needs to be able to be stated in such a way that your question could be answered in the negative. Did we have an impact on our community with this program that we thought was going to make some pro-environmental behavior change? It should be possible to say no. It should also be possible to say yes. It could also be possible to say that we have had a negative experience, right? Those tend to be the three possible outcomes that we often start off with when we talk about creating what we'll get to in a moment, which are hypotheses, right? that we've improved something, we've had no change, or we've had a negative impact. Yeah? We'll come back to that. But at a minimum, our question needs to be testable and needs to be able to be answered in the positive or in the negative, or if it's a descriptive question, then that's a different story. But if it's a causal question, you remember we talked about causal. If it's an associative question, we talked about associative questions at the end of session 1, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Those need to be testable. We need to be able to say there's no association, there's no cause, there's a positive association, there's a negative association, there's a positive cause, or we degraded something. So again, let's return to our question. We've got our running man. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. The running man, which means that it's your turn. So write down your question. Last time I asked you to think about what general category was it? Is it a descriptive? Is it an associative? Or is it a causal question? So look at these 3 questions here. What do you think that first question is? What do local people think of our animal or of us? If you said a descriptive question, you're correct. Okay, next one. So now you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right. Are women more receptive to conservation than are men? Is this an associative or a causal question? All right. If you said associative question, you're correct again. You're shooting 2 for 2 right here. This is great. And lastly, this is an easy one because it's the only other third one that we have. What is the third one? What has been the impact of our intervention? What kind of question is this? Causal. So how does your question fit into those 3 general categories? Most questions will fit into those 3 categories. Think about that. Note that down. And remember, we talked last time about SMART goals and SMART questions, that they need to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant to our question, that they're collecting data that are relevant to our question or to our larger effort, and that they are time-based. So hopefully in your question, you have worked in those SMART goals, that SMART wordings. It's specific. You're not just saying, yeah, I wonder what people think about things. That's not very specific, right? What do people think of cheetah? Oh, I should share with you. We just had our opening day here at the Living Desert, and we got new masks. So I'm going to bend down here and put this on. And it's a cheetah mask. It's upside down. Oh, no. So our cheetah mask. And so is your question specific to cheetahs? If you're asking about cheetahs, is your question specific to whatever your question is? Is it measurable? Can you actually gather data that will determine the impact? Remember, reach is the number of people. Impact is the change that we see. Is it a measurable impact that we can measure? Is there an aspect of impact that we can measure? Say what that is in your question. Is it attainable? Can we see that change in the time frame with T that we're thinking, right? If we're doing a behavior change campaign that might require a long time, say planting quickly growing wood crops that could be harvested for making charcoal, right? We would not want to do necessarily an impact on the amount of sustainable versus unsustainable wood that people use to make charcoal if it requires a few years or a year to get that crop trade over to happen, right? So if we were to do an evaluation in a month, that would be way too soon. So we would want to plan the evaluation so that it's at least a year long, maybe longer. Right? So it needs to be both attainable and in the proper time. And the question needs to be relevant to your larger efforts, your larger goal. Okay, so we've talked about this and we've asked you to refine them. We talked about using the 6 Honest Men activity to flesh out your question. So if you've not done so already, pause on this screen as well and figure out how, here's our running man, figure out how to use the 6 Honest Men activity to flesh out your question what is my question? Who am I trying to talk to? Where am I going to do this? When will I begin the project? And when will I want to look at the follow-up if we're doing a follow-up? How will I do the question? How will I collect the data? How will I ask people to participate? Do I need to use incentives? A bunch of things that we'll talk about in future sessions. But think about that now. And why? Why am I asking this question? So if you've not done this already, or if you'd like to spend some more time now, again, pause the video. Whenever the running man is on the screen, feel free to pause the video and do a little bit of work. I think I need to have a baton in my hand here. So write down that information on your screen. All right. And again, we asked you to think about who is your audience? How old are they? What is their occupation? What do they do? If you're working with ranchers, make certain you're talking to ranchers. That should be your audience. That should be their occupation. Are they mostly male, or are they mostly female people that you're talking to? Are they younger or are they older? Where are they found? Where are you going to do your research? Is that the right place to do it, to really answer your question, to ask your question? Think about your audience. And again, running man. So write these down. Take a minute to pause the video, if you've not already done so, and write down these age questions. How old is the audience that you wanted to talk to? What are they doing? What is their gender? And where are they located? Take a minute, revisit your earlier questions, and maybe improve them. Okay, so thanks for doing that. Continuing on. So now, we have created a question, ideally. And again, we're going to talk, we had our third discussion topic from the first session on the Facebook group, talked about the questions. So think about your question. Is it finely tuned enough that you could answer that question? Is it realistic, right? The R of the SMART goals. Is it relevant? Is it attainable? So once we have a good question, and now we're assuming that you have done so, we can continue to work on this in that topic 3 in session 1 on Facebook, if you are so interested in doing so. So now what we're going to use and move on to is discussing the variables and hypotheses that we will use during our study. All right, we'll talk about what these are and how we can modify them or apply them to our project. Okay, so first, variables. I am very wonky. I love science. So this is one of my favorite things, is identifying the variables, because it makes the project real for me, right? So variables are the things that we are measuring, right? The things that we're measuring, the things that we are manipulating, the things that we are using to choose our participants or our locations, what have you. It's the things that we are really trying to question. So if I'm gonna make up a brand new study right on the spot right here. So I'm still drinking my soda. I wanna see how effective it would be to have recycling bins and trash bins next to them at all of the bus posts, all the bus stops around Maun, just as an example. So I'm going to, this is my question. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to install the recycling bins and the trash bins at half of the bus stops in Maun. The other half of the bus stops in Maun, I'm going to put just a garbage can, just a trash can, just to get a feel for the quantity of trash that's being collected to make certain that it's comparable across the whole area. So if we are thinking about the variables here, we're going to be measuring, of course, the number of cans, or the weight of cans, or the weight of recyclables, let's just call it that, that we gather in the recycling bin, and also the weight of trash. So we'll see whether people are using the recycling bin as a real recycling bin, or whether it's just another trash can, right? And then we can compare the percentages of recycled material that are in the recycled can, or I'm sorry, the recycling bin and the trash bin, when paired together, versus the single trash bin that is in the other bus stop, the bus posts, other bus stops. So what's our variable here? Our independent variable, the thing that we are manipulating, is what? It's not bus posts. It's what we're doing with the bus posts, the bus stops, right? It's that in one of them, we're putting both the recycling and the trash bin. And in the other half, we're putting just the trash bin. So what we are manipulating is whether we are giving a recycling bin or whether we are not. That's our independent variable. Recycling bin present, recycling bin not present. Okay? And then our dependent, or that which we call in social sciences our response variable, is that which we're measuring that we expect to be changed in response to the independent variable. So our independent variable was the presence of two kinds of cans versus one, recycling and trash versus just trash, right? Our dependent variable was what? What did we just say? If you said the proportion of recycled versus trash in the recycling bin, in the trash bin, in the first scenario with the two bins, versus the bin with, or the bus posts that have only the trash bin. That is the dependent variable. The percentage of recycling versus trash. I don't have a piece of trash here that I could hold up to show. Okay, here's one, pen. So if ideally what we would like to see, our optimal outcome, is that in the recycling bin, we have only recyclables. And in the trash bin next to it, we have only the trash. And in the other one, in the bus posts, there'll be some relative proportion of trash and recycling that really is just determined by the volume of the bin, or the volume of the trash that's put in there. So whatever people are throwing away here, this percentage that ideally is sorted entirely into recycling versus trash should be about the same percentage in the single trash bin site. Yeah. So then our independent variable or predictor variable is two cans versus one, recycling and trash versus just trash. Yeah. And the response of the dependent variable is the proportion of recycling or trash that is in the respective bins. Make sense? So there are many others that we could talk about. So let's have another one, just as a thought experiment for you. If we have a bunch of farmers that have sheep, and they are concerned about the possibility of cheetahs, it's upside down again, cheetahs consuming their livestock. And we think that cheetah dogs that are brought in to help guard and protect the sheep, or the goats are better, would be more effective than, say, the farmer out by himself. So in one condition, we'll have just the farmer. In the other condition, we have the farmer and the cheetah dog, the dog to ward away the cheetahs, right? So in that case, what is our independent or our predictor variable? If you said the presence of the cheetah dog, of the dog, that's our variable. That's our predictor variable. Because we are predicting a difference in the farmers that have the dog versus the farmers that don't, in terms of the number of animals that are killed by predators. So that's our predictor. Presence of the dog versus not presence of the dog. So then what's our dependent or our response variable? If you said the number of the number of goats that are consumed by predators in the dog versus the not dog treatment, you're correct again, right? So the relationship between these two variables, and these are both causal implementations, right? Where we're going in and we're doing something and we're predicting a change. They're both causal questions. So in that situation, that type of question, remember we had, of course, descriptive, associative, and causal as the types of questions. So that third question, the causal question, where we're trying to measure the impact of our intervention. The predictor, the presence or absence of the dog, predicts what the response variable is going to do. And the response variable in the case of the dogs was the consumption and the killing of the goats by predators. Right? So at the bottom of the screen, you see this situation that says the response variable, again, what was that in the cheetah dog thing? The number of goats that are killed by predators. The response variable responds to the predictor, which was what? The presence of the dog. Okay, so to say this differently with the specific things that we're talking about, the number of goats that are killed by predators will respond to whether the dog is present or not. That's it, in a causal one. So now another question for you. So let's go to an associative question. And we're interested in knowing whether, let's say, male farmers are better at working with cheetah dogs than are female farmers. Right? So assuming that there's an equal number of male versus female farmers out there, I don't know whether that's true or not, but let's say that there is. If we have an equal number of male versus females who have cheetah dogs, all of them, are males versus females more likely to be successful with their cheetah dogs? Okay, that's our question. So in this case, what is our independent or our predictor variable? If you said gender of the farmer, that's correct, right? Because that's the difference that we're saying, we're predicting to be a difference. And then the response variable is the number of goats that are killed by predators. So same response variable as we had in the first form of the question, right? So with an associative question, you have very similar kinds of setups that you do to a causal question. A descriptive question is a bit more open-ended, and it's not always clear what our predictor variable or what our response variable is, much more than just identifying the things that we want to measure and see and predict or characterize a community or a place with. Right? So in the same situation with the cheetah dogs, if we were to go through and just poll farmers, talk to farmers across all of northern Botswana and ask them if they have had animals that are killed by predators. That's a descriptive question. We're just talking to farmers across the whole of the northern part of Botswana. It's early on in our project. It's early on in our intervention. We're just trying to gather some information. There is no real predictor variable because we haven't stated one with our question, right? Our question is just, what is the trend across northern Botswana in terms of the predators killing goats? So we're just opening things. So our other variables, probably what we would generally call our response variables, the things that we're measuring, right, is how big are the herds? Does the farmer have a permanent crawl around their herds? Do they stay up all night? Do they use fire? Do they have guns? Do they have a cheetah dog? Right? These are all variables that we would ask of the farmer to better understand which farmers are having conflicts with cheetahs and which ones aren't. Maybe a similar question would be, how close are you to a place where cheetahs typically live, like in a national park, for example? So, lots of possibilities. So what we'd like to think about are for your question that you've been designing, that we've just been working on a little bit, what are your variables, right? What is your predictor variable, the thing that we are measuring, or I'm sorry, the thing that we are manipulating, the variable on which we choose where we do our studies, compare this farm to that farm, or this area of the country to this area of the country, or men versus women, or older men versus middle-aged men versus younger men versus very young boys in terms of something, right? Their differences. So what is your predictor variable? Let's write that down. So this is our running man. Similarly, what are your response variable or variables? You'll probably have many. What are the things that you are predicting are going to respond to your predictor variable? Huh? So what are you measuring? Possibly it's ages of people and how they perceive conservation, for example. I'm keeping the questions very simple, obviously. So this is, again, an associative question. Are older people more likely to support conservation of wildlife? Or are younger people more likely to, or middle-aged, or older, or what have you, however you break up your age groups? Are these different groups different in how receptive and supportive they are to conservation, or to whatever your predictor variable is? Or, I'm sorry, whatever your response variable is, excuse me. So take a minute, pause the screen, write down your variables. Okay, so now, thank you for doing that. We'll continue on. Next up. So we've been talking about predictor variables and response variables. Let's set aside those two terms. What we want to talk about now are predictions, which are different from a predictor variable. Predictions and hypotheses, right? A prediction is, in a general sense, a situation where we use some prior knowledge, some data, to measure some things and make a statement about what is likely to happen. And that statement is, of course, conjecture. It's guessing. It's not certain. We don't necessarily know it's going to work that way. And that question, that prediction, should be, again, falsifiable or testable, and certainly be able to be done in many places, right? Or what we call replicable, right? So it needs to be able to be supported or refuted, falsifiable and testable, and also being able to be done across multiple locations, so it can be generalized to other places, to other people, to other situations. Okay. So a prediction, going back to what we just said earlier, I'm going to say in the last slide that let's say younger people tend to be more supportive of conservation than older people. Just making it up. That's a prediction. That's the thing that we are going to predict is going to be true. And that's based on my own experience. That's based on science. That's based on some literature that I've read, you know, about changing patterns and perceptions and support for conservation, which is actually fairly true, that younger people tend to be much more supportive of conservation than do older age groups. Millennials, Gen Y, younger people, Gen Z folks. These are all people that tend to be more supportive of conservation, people who are, say, 35 and younger. That's a prediction, and I make that prediction based on data. All right. Now, a hypothesis is a little different because we're going to have sets of hypotheses that we use to predict the future of our experiment only, right? So in this case, we're going to be able to state this hypothesis very specifically, and it's going to be what we say a mechanistic explanation. This is going to change because this has changed. Or this difference between ages or genders or locations is going to happen because there is a cultural difference between these two groups, right? So there's a mechanistic explanation for that change. So let's talk about hypotheses. This is the next one. Many of you who have taken science classes before are familiar with this idea of a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis is the hypothesis of zero change, right? There'll be no difference. There's no impact, right? So going back to one of our questions that we had a second ago, there is no difference in support for conservation by ages. Younger people are not more supportive than slightly older or even still slightly older. They're all about the same. They're all about equally supportive of conservation. That's a null hypothesis. Let's pick an easier question for this and future, the next couple illustrations, that women are more successful at using cheetah dogs than are men. A null hypothesis there, that's our question, or that's our prediction, let's say. And again, that's based on some data. That our null hypothesis would be what? If it's the hypothesis of no change, no difference, in this case, the null hypothesis would be that women are just as effective as using cheetah dogs as are men. Or we could say it, men are just as effective as women of using cheetah dogs, right? There's no difference. There's no impact. So a null hypothesis, null is, I think, Latin for zero. And null actually might be a term even that you use for zero in many areas of the world. So often we abbreviate this as capital H, hypothesis, with a zero as a lowercase, as a subscript after that H. And for many people, statisticians especially, we say that the null hypothesis is the most important hypothesis, which may not make sense because saying that the hypothesis of no change being the most important one, well, from a statistics perspective, we need to first disprove the null hypothesis, right? So when we do a statistical test, and if you're familiar with statistics, when we get a significant difference, we have what we call a p-value of less than 0.05%, right? And a p of less than 0.05, not percent, 5%, less than 5%, or p less than 0.05. Less than 0.05 means that it is likely to be different. It is significantly different between the two groups, or the impact had an impact. The intervention had an impact, right? So if we get a significant difference, we can reject the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is the hypothesis of no change, of no difference, of no impact, right? So really, the null hypothesis is the most important hypothesis because that is the hypothesis that your statistical tests are testing. So if you find a significant result in your statistics, you have rejected the null hypothesis, right? So you can see why many people, statisticians especially, call the null hypothesis the most important. So with that, null hypothesis is one of the hypotheses, and there are usually two, at least, other hypotheses. So in the case of the men versus women with the ranchers, our null hypothesis was what again? If you said that men and women were just as effective at using cheetah dogs, you're right. And one of our alternative hypotheses could be that that our prediction was correct, which is that women are more effective at using cheetah dogs than are men. There are fewer goats being killed than in herds from farmers who are women who use cheetah dogs than men, right? So women have, on average, only one goat killed over a year by predators, whereas men have 10 that are killed over a year, right? That's one alternative hypothesis. That's probably what we would call our favored hypothesis, because it is our prediction, right? That women are more effective than men at using cheetah dogs because they work better with dogs or what have you, whatever the mechanism actually is. So that's one alternative hypothesis. Our second alternative hypothesis is just the opposite. And what's the opposite of that first alternative hypothesis? If you said that men are more effective than women at using cheetah dogs, you're right. right? So now we have three hypotheses. We have men and women are about the same in using cheetah dogs. And now I'm going to use higher or less than, meaning have fewer dogs killed or fewer goats killed. So first one, men and women are about the same. Second hypothesis, women have fewer goats that are killed than do men, right? So you can think of these as sort of bar graphs, right? Women have many fewer goats that are killed by cheetahs than do men because of the cheetah dogs, right? That's first hypothesis, our favorite hypothesis, same as our prediction. Second hypothesis is just the opposite, that men have fewer goats that are killed by cheetahs than do women, right? And so you can see now that with these three hypotheses, only one can be best supported by the data, right? No difference. Women doing better than men, men doing better than women. Make sense? So now, what are your hypotheses? Right? If you're working with a team, working with other people, you can do this. If you want to do this yourself, totally great too. What's your null hypothesis? What is your hypothesis of no change? There'll be no impact of the independent variable, or what we also call the predictor variable, on the dependent variable, which we also call the response variable, right? So the hypothesis of no change is no association, no difference, no impact between our two groups, or however many groups, right? What's your null hypothesis? Let's write that down first. Second, what are your alternative hypotheses? Ideally, your question is simple and has only two groups you're comparing or evaluating for an association or a causal impact. And if so, one of your first alternative hypothesis is that group one should be better than group two, or in the opposite, the other alternative hypothesis, group one is worse than group two. So just the opposite. All right, so take a moment, write down your hypotheses. Okay, so we'll continue on now. Note that the hypotheses can only be tested. They cannot be proven, right? A question is never proven because the way that we do science is that we pose questions, we pose hypotheses, and then we test them. We never prove them because you only need one piece of absolutely true piece of data that could completely collapse your question, collapse your proof, right? So very often in scientific shorthand, and absolutely in sort of media-based shorthand, people talk about things being proven. Coffee is proven to be better for you than not having coffee, right? Drinking wine improves your health. It is proven, right? How many times have you read stories saying just the opposite of the first one, right? So that's why it's best to say that not that it's proven, but that it is supported, right? It is supported. The data supports the statement that women have fewer goats that are killed by predators than do men, right? Supported, never proven. Just a general thing about science. It's something that gets under my skin a lot because it's sloppy reporting and it's not really useful ways to relate science because we only need one set of data that will disprove it and then your proof vanishes, right? So better to say supported, not proof. Okay. So now predicting outcomes. We've talked about this already, so I won't go into this in too much effort, but if we had a series of predicted outcomes, and I'd like you to think about this for your hypotheses, what would be the public support for a null hypothesis that is not refuted? What we'll call a true null hypothesis. right? What is the null hypothesis for no difference between your two groups, your two locations, your different age groups, your gender differences, people who use dogs versus people who don't use dogs, bus posts that have recycling bins versus bus posts that don't, right? What would be the impact and the perception of the public for that outcome? Similarly, what would be the public support for what we'll say is our preferred hypothesis, that the recycling bin is going to make it more likely for people to recycle than the trash, or be better at recycling than other posts, or that women are better at using cheetah dogs than are men, or that younger people are more supportive of conservation than older people, what have you. Similarly, what is the public support for the alternative hypothesis? What would the public think of the opposite? That if men were better at using cheetah dogs than women. Or I guess it'd be this way. If men have fewer goats being killed than women, or having older people being more supportive of conservation than younger people. What would be the impact on public support, public perception? And you could even think about the impact in your organization of this. Take a minute, pause the video, and jot this down. All right, so now we'll continue on. So we've talked about some basics of experimental design. We've talked about questions. We've talked about variables. We've talked about hypotheses. We've talked about predictions. And we've talked about the implications of those predictions and hypotheses, and the perception of them by the communities. So now we're changing tack quite a bit here. We're changing direction quite a bit here. How do we find that stuff out? How do we find out that information? How do we gather that information? I'm going to take you through a very quick and by necessity, kind of short introduction to a whole bunch of ways that we collect social science data, right? They're all on this screen. It looks crazy confusing, but it will be clear as glass before our class is done. Not just today, but in general. It'll be a little murky after today, but if you take good notes, you'll have this down real well. All right, so we'll continue on. So the first thing that people think of when we think about collecting social science data are structured surveys. I have a series of questions in my hand here that I would like to ask you, sir or ma'am. It would take 5 minutes. I have about 10 questions here. There are questions about your perceptions of conservation here in Southern Africa. Would you be so interested? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Question 1, blah, blah, blah. I'll ask you this. It's very structured. We have it all written down. The questions are predetermined. We know what they are. That's how most people do surveys. It's probably, you've participated in probably dozens of these in your life, if not much more. And it's an easy way to learn about the knowledge, the attitudes, the beliefs of a large group of people very quickly, right? Well-designed studies, well-designed surveys are able to really have a clear goal, which we've been talking about. They know who they want to talk to, so they're not just wandering around on the street and talking to people randomly, unless the goal of that survey is to understand the general populace view of whatever it is, right? Of our impact of conservation of cheetahs or what have you, yeah? So structured surveys, we're going to focus on this quite a bit during our sessions for the rest of this workshop, but it will not be all that we focus on. We're going to talk about the uses of a great diversity of things, right? So structured surveys, very common. It's what we're going to be focusing on quite a bit, but not exclusively. And here's a little funny thing for you, because we want you all to be out there being polar bears. Get it? Right? Polar bears. Do you have a few minutes to answer a short survey? I like puns. Sorry. So, but it's not just structured surveys. that we can use. Just because everyone is coming this way means that you have to use the same tool. There are lots of benefits for these other ones. I'm going to briefly introduce them. Alex and I are going to be talking about them more in the following sessions. So let's not be limited by just surveys, or to just surveys, excuse me. We also have interviews. We have semi-structured interviews. They're kind of similar to structured surveys, but they're a lot of open-ended questions. Tell me how you feel about poaching. How do you feel about litter at bus posts? What do you think about dogs? Would you be receptive to the idea of having a dog to protect your goats? If so, why? If not, why not? Right? These are more open-ended questions. I'm not asking people to say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely are you to recycle? Right? Where 5 is most likely, 1 is least likely, 3 is about middle. Right? We're asking open-ended questions very often in semi-structured interviews. These are more discussion-based, kind of one-on-one. They last a much longer time typically than do structured interviews, or structured surveys, excuse me. So semi-structured interviews are a great way to learn knowledge and gain insight from our community members. Because they're more open-ended, we're not constraining how people can answer. I would like a 5. I would rate that a 2. I would, yes, no, right? Those are very structured questions. My name is James. I live in Maun or wherever, right? Here, we may ask those same kinds of questions just to gather those kinds of informations. But in addition, the majority of the time in these semi-structured interviews are these open-ended questions. They're great because they're really useful for gathering novel ideas, new input. Great breakthroughs often come from these semi-structured interviews. The qualitative data that comes out of this is fantastic. And Alex is going to be talking a lot about how to analyze these qualitative questions in the next couple sessions, or rather towards the end of our time together in sessions 8 and 9. And so as a consequence, they take a lot more time per survey. Very useful, but they take a long time to implement. It takes a long time to process the data. It's not as easy to use as the information that comes out of structured surveys, because those tend to be more quantitative, more number-based. But these semi-structured interviews provide really great insights into community perceptions. So it's a great way to get in-depth information from many fewer people. Whereas structured surveys, you can gather a lot of information very quickly. Okay, so here's your running man. Let's take a moment, pause the screen in a moment, and think about how and when you may want to use this approach, semi-structured interviews. What would this be particularly useful for you in your own research or in the students that you are training? Right? How could you use semi-structured interviews in your social science conservation work? Take a minute, pause the video, and write this down. Just a couple sentences, a couple words. Okay, so now that we're going again, let's go on to the next type of data collection method. So similarly to our semi-structured interviews, it's kind of a hybrid really of semi-structured interviews and the structured surveys, are focus groups. Focus groups are when you bring a bunch of groovy people together. Very interesting. In this case, a bunch of people who work with marine mammals in Germany in a very cold winter in 2018, and everyone is drinking lots of alcohol, and we had a great focus group. No, don't give your focus groups alcohol. You will not get the best data. So typically with real focus groups, you have one surveyor, say me, as I'm in the left side of that screen, And around 6 to 10, 8 to 10 people. For me, I prefer about 6 to 8 because some people will drop out, will not show up for the focus group after you recruit them to come to a specific time. And then typically with focus groups, what they're most useful for is understanding what the community thinks, or that group of people as representatives of that community, what they think, right? So typically with these, you pose open-ended questions, qualitative data, again, the open-ended questions. So we might say similar questions to the semi-structured interviews. Tell me what you think about the conservation of cheetahs here in your neighborhood. Oh, thank you very much, ma'am. Sir, what do you think? And maybe you go around the whole room and ask all of the, say, 6 people who are in the focus group what they each think. So, oh, thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you, right? You thank people for their information. You don't say, oh, that's exactly right. Really great insight, right? Because then you're biasing the responses of everybody afterwards. So you just say, oh, okay, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your perspective. Oh, good, right? So you pose the questions, you jot down or record with an audio recorder. Phone works great. Record their answers and then later transcribe it, write it down, type it into your computer. And you'll have discussion between people, and you might ask people in response to what one person says. Maybe they say something kind of controversial, and you say, oh, well, what do other people think of this idea? And then you'll get sort of a discussion between the different participants in your focus group, right? So it's a nice way to get have a bit of a conversation among many people at once, ideally from a cohesive community, so that you can better understand what that community thinks about whatever your question is and see how they respond to each other. So because you have multiple people there, you can tell from body language, you can tell from vocal responses of people like, ish, oh, ugh, you know, whether an idea is supported or not. So you can use that to gather a lot of information very quickly. It's very complicated again, but it's not impossible to use, and it provides really fascinating, really useful data. It's part of the reason why very often when companies are testing different products like phones or pens or electronics or what have you, they'll do focus groups, because they want to know a group of people, what they think of each other's ideas, as well as what the ideas that each person thinks. So it's a nice way to summarize what an individual thinks and how popular that idea is across that community. So similar to the semi-structured interviews, you'll get lots of interesting novel responses, new ideas, maybe some crazy ones. Guaranteed you'll get some crazy ones. But there'll be some really useful, really neat ideas that come out of these focus groups. One challenge to focus groups is because you have multiple people who are listening, they are prone to what we call groupthink, where when one person says something, everybody else feels that they need to agree with it, because maybe that's the right idea, that's the social norm that most people are supposed to think or feel that they're supposed to think, even if they don't really think that. They don't want to say, no, oh, that person's wrong. We don't do that, right? So in communities and cultures that are very supportive and positive and optimistic, like very many really wonderful groups of people around the world, focus groups can be kind of challenging, because people really do defer to, say, a person in power, a person who's of a more elder status in the community, a person who's authoritative. Everybody will defer to that person for the answer. So you'll have to think about how you structure those focus groups. It's very important to know who you're inviting, so as to try to get around this groupthink and maybe try to diffuse it. And you can, it's possible with interview techniques to do so, but it takes a real skill to do that. So focus groups, the third of our approaches. Remember, the first one was what? Structured surveys. The second one was what? semi-structured interviews, and then focus groups. Okay, so we're 3 in. So take a moment now. Think about what it is that, how and whether you could use focus groups in what communities. When would you, when wouldn't you use focus groups for your research question? Take a minute, pause the video, and we'll get started again. All right, so continuing on. This is a neat one, this personal meaning map analysis. It's a little complicated to explain without doing it, and in the future, in our sessions, we will do one of these. But for right now, what we try to do is, instead of just having people do what we call, what is called in many cultures, brainstorming or sharing ideas, where someone says, okay, we have to solve this problem. What do people think are solutions that we could do to solve that problem? This is very similar to that, but it's done visually. Right? So for example, this is a personal meaning map analysis that I did with some children and asked them what they think about shark fishing and shark finning in particular, but kids don't know what finning is, where they cut off the fins on sharks to sell the fin for shark fin soup. So it's pretty uniformly thought as being inhumane and incredibly environmentally destructive. So we were interested in understanding what children in this community thought about shark finning, or what we called fishing for sharks. Very often, the people will come up with really great things on the really great responses to that prompt, like the bottom center one where they say, if we fish sharks, the next food level lower on the food chain will increase, right? So if we take out sharks, the things that the sharks would eat would increase in number, right? That's interesting, accurate. Some might be particularly not relevant to your question. I like sharks and dolphins. Well, that could be relevant. Maybe you're interested in knowing how much people support sharks, right? Or sharks can't go in dirty water, right? So people put all these kinds of ideas that are their responses or things that they think are most important to your first prompt. In this case, that prompt is rather broad. What do you think of fishing for sharks? You get all sorts of things. They can eat people. Like, oh, I guess sharks can eat the fishers. I guess that's what they're thinking. So sometimes you'll get answers that are not really relevant to what you're trying to find out, but very often you'll get very important ones. Okay, so think about how you could do a personal meaning map analysis with your question. Maybe you get a group of people together and you say, or maybe it's your staff, let's say that. You bring your staff together or your students together and you say, okay, I'm interested in knowing what you all think about or know about rancher conflict with predators. So you put that as the center prompt, and then you ask the audience to write down their responses. And then you do a first order analysis, right? Which are these first questions. And then you say, okay, enough of the first order questions. Now let's go to those questions that you just wrote down, or those responses that you just wrote down. And let's talk about sharks can't go in dirty water. What does that mean? What are the impacts of that on fishing for sharks? Oh, well, sharks don't like polluted water. And okay, well, that would be a line that you would draw off from that first bubble. And okay, well, what does that mean? It could be the next order. So that's your second order of analysis. And then you could have a third order of analysis where people respond to the second order questions or observations. Okay, so how could you use this admittedly very vague, but beginning introduction to this technique of personal meaning map analysis in your question for finding out more from your community? Take a minute, pause the video, and write down some ideas. All right, so we'll continue on. This is a tool that people use quite a bit when they're first beginning to work in a community. They want to know what people think about shark finning, for example, or poaching, or the conservation of cheetahs, or of recycling. right? And then you can find out from that what people know, and then that can define your future work. So for general descriptive questions, remember we had our 3 types of questions: descriptive, causal, and associative. Our descriptive questions could benefit from this kind of a technique greatly. Also with focus groups, that'd be a great one for a descriptive kind of question, if we're interested in finding out what a community thinks the level of support for those questions are, or those interventions are. Okay, so that was our 4th type of data collection. Next, a little bit of Star Wars for anybody who's interested in Star Wars. The woman in the center there with the box is my wife, and I'm pretending that she is going to a Star Wars convention, which happen all over the world, as you know. And she is doing a passive observation of what Star Wars fans think of conservation. And she's doing this by going around to them and asking them to donate, right? Or I take that back. That's not what she's doing with her passive observation. That is what she's doing here. But to do a passive observation, she's standing in one place unobtrusively off to the side where people can't see her very much. And she is watching how the Star Wars people interact with the box, right? She's set that box on a table and she is standing away from the box, but within view of it. So she was looking how the Star Wars people, the people in their costumes, are going over to the box. Are they reading it? Are they like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I don't have any money. I checked my pants. I would have otherwise donated. Or are they going over to it and saying, conservation, I don't care about that. That's not relevant to me. What is that doing here? You know, or are they trying to steal it, right? This is all passive observation data. Remember, we are animals, right? Many of us in this class are biologists, and you're used to going out and measuring or monitoring the movement of species or the behavior of species. Humans are another kind of animal. We can measure ourselves too, right? We can stay off to the side and we can watch how people interact with each other, with a donations box, what have you. So passive observation. And if you've done behavior studies like that with animals, you can do them with people just as easily. So that's technique number 5. And it's a great way to work on it because you can gather a lot of information really quickly. If you're familiar with this kind of behavior stuff, you can do both snapshot or longitudinal studies where you look at a group and see what everyone is doing at a certain bit of time. So if there's 10 people in the group, you watch everyone. Of the 10, 8 people are reading their cell phone and 2 are staring up at the trees. Maybe you're interested in knowing how much people use cell phones in national parks, right? Longitudinal studies are where you follow one person for a long time. And every couple minutes, you see what they're doing. You record what they're doing. So it's a way to tell X percentage of the time a person is on their cell phone on our longitudinal time selections. And X percent of time they're looking at the trees, X percent of time they're talking with their friends, they're making social communion, they're making meaning with their communities, what have you, right? This is particularly useful for both the associative or comparative kinds of studies as well as descriptive studies, right? So we're trying to understand how people are doing things. Okay, so passive observation. Now, take a minute and think about how you could do this passive observation in your work. Could you use passive observation as a data collecting tool for your question? If so, why? If not, why not? Take a minute, pause the video, and we'll get started again after that. All right, so continuing on. This is a fun one, card sorts. Card sorts are where you have, here I have 8 cards on the screen. They're just pictures of animals. And you might be interested in understanding what animals are particularly threatening to you. Or what animals are most threatening to your children? Or what animals are more likely to crop raid or affect your crops that you are growing, your soybeans or what have you? And you ask them to take these cards that you give in a pile that have been shuffled and randomized, and you ask them to sort them. There's 8, so we'll ask them to sort them in one long line from most problematic in terms of their likelihood to eat their crops to least problematic, least likely to eat their crops, right? So it's a nice way to assess their knowledge and their perceptions and their attitudes. So all 3, their knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, can be assessed with this. It's a great way to assess their perception, their support, their attitude about different animals or of different ecosystems, because you can have these cards be whatever. They could be of a messy bus stop. They could be a clean bus stop. They could be a bus stop with a lot of people. They could be a bus post with very few people, what have you, right? So you ask them to rank them from most desirable to least desirable across your table. Note that with this, it's particularly useful for populations that have low literacy rates. Could be maybe rural communities that don't have a lot of education, if that's common, or with young people, or people who have vision problems, maybe older people who can't read very well because they are elder and their eyesight has degraded. So it's great for people who can't read for one reason or another very well. It's also just kind of a fun engagement tool as well, even for people who do read well. Everybody loves to sort cards. Everyone loves cards. So you can ask lots of questions with these card sorts, and you're limited only by your imagination and your creativity. It's really a fun tool. So now let's take a minute and think of a situation where you could possibly use a card sort to gather some information, some knowledge, some attitude, or some behavior about, say, wildlife or plants or ecosystems or some aspect of conservation. What would the cards look like? How would you use them? What question would you answer? Pause the video and let's try to come up with a way that we would use card sorts. Okay, so continuing on. Last is a category that I'll just kind of collectively call art. This is very qualitative, very open-ended, very broad. It's, again, very useful for people who are pre-verbal or maybe not so good with reading at all, low literacy rates. It's also a nice way to be able to do what we call a contextual assessment. We ask people, in the case of this drawing here where we asked this young girl to talk about elephants, what do you think about elephants? And she drew this drawing of elephants, and she included grass and made it on a savanna, clearly, because there's lots of yellow there, right? It's sort of in the dry season, probably. It's a big tusker, and she says, "Help me and my family!" exclamation point. And then across the top it says, "Save the elephants." So this young lady clearly feels strongly about elephants for whatever reason. So we could go into communities and we could ask, this works particularly well for younger people. Older people tend to feel a little silly drawing, but for young people, it's a great way to do assessments, drawing. But we could ask them some question that's particularly relevant. You know, what do you think of poaching? These are open-ended questions. That's why this is a qualitative assessment. It can be an educational assessment. It could be an attitude assessment. It could also be a behavior change assessment too. Because you could ask them to say, what does it look like when you recycle? If they put something that looks really weird down where people are, I don't know, throwing recycling up in the air or burying it under the ground, clearly they don't have a particularly good understanding of how recycling works, right? So drawing is only one way though there are many kinds of art, right? Many of you are probably very creative, wonderful singers, or great dancers, or you like taking photos, maybe with your phone quite a bit. Yeah. So for each of these, you can come up with ways to be able to assess people's perception using these different forms of art. The drawing, music, dance, those seem pretty clear. Photo voice is probably a term that you've not heard of, but it's a great tool for assessing, using art to assess their attitudes, especially because maybe we ask a community member, or ask community members in general, please take your phones and take pictures of things in your experience or on your farm that you are particularly proud. Okay? So they take the pictures and they share those pictures with you, and then you can draw data from those pictures. You can see what is the content material, what else is going on around it, right? So if they're particularly proud of, say, a hand pump that they had dug themselves, if the hand pump is right by their house, clearly they're not having to walk very far either to get that water, right? So it's both close, it's proximity, as well as convenience for being able to pull the water out of the ground. If they've put that pump in a place that is very odd and difficult to get to, you could draw conclusions from that about their design or their maybe limitations in terms of where water is or where a well could be drilled, what have you, right? So photo voice is a great way to be able to capture data about how people feel about something, what they value, what they prioritize. It's a wonderful tool. And those photos could be just sent to you via WhatsApp. It's a really useful tool. So how could you go about with these, any of these, drawing, music, dance, photo voice, taking pictures? There's probably others that you could come up with as well. How could you use art to assess some aspect of your question, of your research project? Take a minute, pause the video, and we'll get started again. All right, so continuing on. Art has been used in a lot of different ways. This was a wonderful article that was in a magazine that's based out of the US, but I think is international, called Time. And they were characterizing, asking children that had migrated to the United States what they thought about the migration process. And this is the ways in which they've characterized their experience. Of course, we can take odd pictures. We can ask people to write things down too, to describe verbally what things are. We can ask them to draw the pictures. We can ask them to come up with a dance, all sorts of ways. Art is really a useful tool. It shows people's priorities. It shows their creativity. Some people are better at expressing themselves through art than they are verbally. And it's great to be able to provide them that opportunity. So, lots of evaluation methods that we have that we've just been talking about. Our structured surveys, our semi-structured interviews, our focus groups, personal meaning maps, our passive observation where we watch people do things, our card sorts, and then our art, journaling, drawing, photo voice, what have you. All of these are ways that we can evaluate the impact on our knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors of our communities. And of course, the goal for all of these is what? What is the goal for conservation biology? Pro-environmental behavior change that is both locally acceptable and culturally appropriate. We gather that information with this set of tools. And we'll spend a lot of time talking over the rest of this workshop about these tools and creating them, particularly the first one, structured surveys. Everybody feel good? It's a lot of excitement, right? It's a lot of new things, a lot of neat opportunities. So those are the tools that we can use. One of the last things we want to talk about today is when we would use those tools and what would be the goals of those tools at those times, right? Often when we do evaluations or impact evaluations, we often call them, it's determined based on when we are doing them relative to our impact or our intervention. So, for example, if we're just starting a project, we're just trying to figure out how to work with farmers to get them to reduce their conflict with predators in the area so that they benefit by not losing goats and livestock, and the wildlife benefits by them not being killed by angry farmers. If we're just beginning the process, even before we've done anything else in the community, we do what's called a front-end evaluation. It's before we begin the project, we're gathering information to better design our intervention, better understand how the community feels about things so that we don't ask a culturally inappropriate thing. And typically front-end evaluations are often descriptive. We're trying to gather information about what the perception is of the community. All right, first one, front end, before we get going. Second, formative. Once we begin a project, we've started working with those ranchers, and we've learned from the front end evaluation that they're not crazy about having dogs, but they would be okay with having dogs, live with their goats to help protect those goats from predators. We also asked them about lots of other things, chili fences and permanent crawls and temporary crawls that are really well designed, and lots of other things, fire, noise, all sorts of things. And the community seemed to be most receptive to the idea of using dogs. So once we found that out at the front end evaluation, we begin designing that project. And we've started working with the communities, we started working with the farmers, we're understanding how they would be most effective and most likely to adopt it. This is the formative part. We're asking them, going out periodically and saying, hey, how's it working with the dog? Is the dog reducing predation by cheetahs? Okay. This tends to be kind of in between descriptive and what we call hypothesis-driven or causal research questions. All right, so front end, before the project begins, formative, while the project is going on, while we're doing the intervention, what have you. And then last, after we've finished the project, all of the grant money has been used up, and we want to be able to determine and quantify our impact or characterize our impact. We would do a summative evaluation. So after the project is concluded, we're all done. We are definitely hypothesis driven. So we're doing either an associative or a causal study. So we are driven by hypotheses, and we are trying to characterize and assess the impact that we've done. Okay? So front-end, formative, and summative. Think about when you're doing your project, and I'd like you now to think about that process. Because typically when we're doing the front-end research, you could think of this scribble going across the screen here as being a summarizing of the breadth of the noise, of the diversity of opinions that are found, right? At the front end research, it's very broad. So the noisiness in the project is very large, right? It goes very high to very low, however we characterize that noise. We got people who want to just kill all the cheetahs. We have people who want to save all the cheetahs, but only if they're given a whole lot of money, or people who aren't certain that there are cheetahs around. There's all sorts of different ideas, right? So then when we're doing the formative research, we're implementing the project here in this middle phase. You see that the noise decreases. So it's getting smaller. It's no bigger than that range. It's decreased quite a bit until eventually towards the end, once we get to the summative phase down here at the end part of the project, the noisiness in the project, people tend to feel very clearly and strongly. Either those cheetah dogs made a huge impact, everybody agrees. Those cheetah dogs had no impact whatsoever, everybody agrees. Right? If the intervention was consistent, the noisiness in the project goes down as we go from front end to formative to summative. Okay? So that means that we are getting better, right? The quality of our intervention, the quality of our research is getting better. All right, so to summarize then, we are doing our science and we are defining the process. So tracking our progress through this circle. We've talked about the observation. Oops. We've talked about our observation. We've talked about our question. We've created hypotheses today. Last session, we talked about creating the question. We worked on that a bit more today. We created hypotheses today. We created predictions today. We talked about the diversity of tools that we can use to collect those data. So we're in the very beginning stages of designing our experiment. So we have gone through the observation. We've gone through the question. We should be through, and will, once we do the Facebook discussion, our set of hypotheses. And very soon we will get into the experimental phase. So if we go to our next one with the babies, we've made our observation, we've asked the question, we've formed hypotheses. So we're through steps 2 of the baby scientific method. We're going to design that experiment and then perform it in the future. And we're going to plan for how to analyze the data, report the findings, and invite others to reproduce the results a little later too. So if we think about the scientific method as we've been talking about, there are about 11 steps depending upon who you talk to. And again, like I said at the outset, this is a scientific method. There are many kinds. But this is how I think of science. And so this is what we'll use here as a working approach. We observe or suspect a pattern. We've talked about that already for your question. We have positive significance of observed differences. I think that this is more than this. Right? We've made the observation. We've created the question to possibly explain why this is more than this. Right? Next, we've created testable hypotheses, which we did today. So the last 6 steps involve designing the experiment, collecting the data, or planning to collect the data, as we will do in the class. We'll plan for how to analyze the data and talk through some statistics. We'll talk about using those statistics to evaluate our hypotheses when we're talking about our statistics. We'll talk about what to do with those conclusions, what are the implications of those programs, and then also noting problems in our current work, which we'll talk about as well. So we are going to be going from soup to nuts in this class, as we say in the United States. We're going to start with nothing and get to the point where we have a whole project, as we can see on our plan here. So thank you for being patient with us today and for participating in this class. We are honored to get to work with you all and hope that it has been and will continue to be of great use to you. Please feel free to message us in our WhatsApp group and also on our Facebook page as well for the Facebook group. We want this to be most useful for you and get us all to the point where we can be very effective community conservationists, because communities matter for conservation and we need to work together to make that happen. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for your interest. And let's go do some good science. We'll continue on with session 3 in a couple days. Take care, everyone.